This is The Argonaut with Jason Economou. Today's episode is a follow-up interview with my friend Matt Jachowski, Director of Data, Technology, and Innovation with the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement. Matt joined me on episode 4 to talk about some of the work he was doing in the wake of the Lahaina wildfire recovery in trying to house people, and the work that the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement is doing as well. That interview, as you'll find out in this interview, was actually recorded back in January. So I got together with Matt because his work never stopped. He's just been chugging along, and he had some new data to share with us that is really relevant to the discussion of housing in relation to short-term rentals and how to address the housing crisis in the wake of Maui's recovery effort in a manner that's beneficial to residents. And specifically, we talk a lot about short-term rentals on Maui and a subsection of short-term rentals called the Minatoya properties. And throughout this conversation, we spend a lot of time talking about data that is publicly available. If you go to the website app.app.helpingmaui.org/data/public. Once again, this is app.helpingmaui.org/data/public. And if you go to that website, you can follow along with this conversation. There is a page called Minatoya List Statistics, and that'll take you to a lot of the data that we're directly referencing here. If you don't want to be looking at your computer, or if you're doing some other stuff while you're listening to this, don't worry. Matt does a great job of explaining everything, and I think it's pretty interesting. This will be particularly interesting to a Maui-based audience or a Hawaii-based audience. But really, I think anybody can enjoy this conversation because we get into a lot of the issues related to housing and the economy. And Matt is just an incredibly bright person who has just a wonderful heart. I mean, he is a kind and caring individual, and those are the types of people I like to talk to. Thoughtful, kind, caring individuals. So I hope you enjoy this. As always, if you have any questions, any comments, any follow-up, please feel free to email me at jason, Jason, @elcmaui.com. And please like, subscribe, share, tell your friends, leave a comment, whatever. Leave a review. I love the reviews. And for now, just enjoy the episode. Matt Jachowski, welcome back to The Argonaut with Jason Economou.
Hi, Jason. Thanks for having me.
So, Matt, you recently sent me a link to some data that you put together related to short-term rentals, commonly referred to as the Minatoya properties. And these are specifically transient vacation rentals located in the apartment zoning districts of Maui. Remarkably, people heard your last episode, which we recorded back in January, and they thought it was recorded very recently because of how relevant your information was. So it's awesome that you're back on with us. And maybe you can kind of walk us through what you're up to and what you put together.
Yeah, so the state of Hawaii, the legislature, just a few weeks ago passed a bill that gives the counties more power to regulate short-term rentals, including phasing them out in some cases. And I believe it was the day after the mayor announced plans to phase out what you called the Minatoya list, as it's colloquially known. But it's basically these short-term rentals that are operating in areas that are zoned residential or zoned for apartments. Yeah, I knew that data around these units and where these units are and what kind of units these are would be very important for informing both the public and our leaders in the county government as they embark on potentially phasing out these short-term rentals. I just want to make sure everyone's working with good information when we tackle this issue.
Awesome. So what have you put together?
Yeah. So, I work for the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement, and with the support of the Hawaii Community Foundation, I've built the Maui Data Hub. So the URL is app.helpingmaui.org/data/public, and it has links to all sorts of data that I've collected on different things, including, what's going on with rents on Maui, what are the demographics of people asking CNHA for help with housing, some data on the displaced immigrant population, which was fairly large in Lahaina, that was collected in collaboration with the grassroots org Roots Reborn that works with immigrants and migrants. Data on properties in Lahaina that were destroyed and focusing in on homeowner properties and trying to understand more about those properties. And then finally, a page dedicated to this Minatoya list and what these properties look like. So I'm trying to share that widely with the public, with our leaders, and with the media, so that when we're making this decision, I think all decisions are better when we have good data to base them off of.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Lahaina property data right now, and this is fascinating. And I just want to share this for some context. You have here 2020 fire impacted structures, and that leaves 774 structures that were not fully destroyed. But of those 2020 properties, 1,246 of the structures, 62% of them were just destroyed completely.
Yeah. And some of those structures, let's be clear, some of those structures were apartment buildings, right? So one destroyed structure meant many destroyed properties and homes.
So you get into that with another chart underneath there where it explains that the properties are really 2,141 properties that were just wiped out. So
yeah,
we already had this massive housing crisis that we talked about last time, and this puts a finer point of just how much worse it got overnight.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the major issues is that we had a lot of multi-generational homes. So even though there was only, it's still a lot, like 2,100 properties that got destroyed, the number of households that were displaced from these destroyed properties is much larger than that.
Yeah, and I recommend everybody go to app.helpingmaui.org/data/public. And I'm going to put a link to that in the notes for this, because you break it down into property tax class as well. So that's really fascinating, just how many, over 1,200 owner-occupied units, 174 registered long-term rentals, but then you have the non-owner-occupied class, 773 of those were destroyed, and those are often long-term rentals as well. They're just not registered as such. And it was really, even though tourism is largely focused on the west side, only 680 of the units that were destroyed, it looks like, were transient vacation rentals. And that aligns a lot with the data that I've seen through FEMA, where what happened in Lahaina was it was really the workforce housing that was heavily impacted. So we're talking about, this wasn't wealthy property owners exclusively that were impacted by this fire. This wasn't a luxury area. This is real working class neighborhoods that were impacted.
That's right. Yes.
All right.
But let's kind of jump into this data on the Minatoya list.
Yes, please.
So again, just to describe, right, the county publishes this list. It's publicly available on their website. And based on that list and public property tax data, I've generated all this analysis. All this data is public. But basically, there's a bunch of properties that were operating as short-term rentals, like back in the 80s. And then the zoning that those properties were on changed, right? The zoning changed to be, they call it the apartment district properties, right? They're supposed to be residential according to zoning, but they were allowed to continue operating as short-term rentals. They were grandfathered in. And now the proposal on the table is to, make them conform to the zoning and strip their ability to operate as short-term rentals. So what I think is important is just going through the numbers here. In the county of Maui, there's about 7,000 of these properties that are allowed to operate as short-term rentals in these apartment-zoned areas. About 6,000 of them are currently registered as short-term rentals. Most of them are on the island of Maui. There's 246 on Molokai and 0 on Lanai. And 96% of these short-term rentals are in West Maui and South Maui. So really, there's a couple in Hana, there's some in Paia, and there's some in Molokai, but basically they're all in South Maui and West Maui. So what I think is really interesting is drilling down more on where these properties are located. And actually, like, a huge number of them are in Kihei. Kihei is the number one spot for these. And I think one thing that's really interesting is that Kihei in total has about 4,000 short-term rentals. 2,500 of them are on the Minatoya list.
Wow.
And if you've ever been to Maui, it's these condo complexes that line South Kihei Road. As you drive down South Kihei Road, all these beachfront properties. So if this Minatoya effort passes, we're going to see like 60% of Kihei's short-term rentals disappear, and it's going to largely change the character of the town. I think that's a decision that is correctly made by our leaders and the public as to whether that's something they want. I'll just speak for me personally. I want to see housing for our residents before we prioritize housing for our more places for our visitors to stay. But I think that's a decision for everyone to make as a community and as a government. But it's important to note it would have a drastic impact on Kihei. The impact on other areas of Maui is not quite so drastic, but like in Kahana, for example, you would see about 1/3 of the properties, 1/3 of the short-term rentals would no longer be operating as short-term rentals. And that's still a lot of properties, right?
Yeah.
And Kahana is in West Maui. I think another really interesting thing to look at is, the reason why we're even talking about phasing out these short-term rentals is, well, broadly, it's to get more housing for our residents, but in a more targeted sense, is to help to provide more housing for our fire survivors, our displaced fire survivors in the short term. There have been opportunities for these owners to step forward and voluntarily offer to help housing. Through FEMA's direct lease program, through the state's rental assistance program, and even through CNHA's Kakoa Maui housing program. If we look at the data of these Minatoya short-term rentals, and we compare that to the list of the properties getting the county's wildfire property tax exemption, because basically, if you're housing a fire survivor with a long-term lease, with a lease of 12 months or longer, you don't have to pay property taxes for 12 to 18 months. So what I did is I intersected those two lists, right? The Minatoya short-term rentals and the county's property tax exemption data. Just 1 out of every 18 Minatoya short-term rentals are currently offering long-term rentals to fire survivors. That is across South Maui and West Maui. If you drill down on West Maui, it's 1 out of 10 of these Minatoya short-term rental owners are voluntarily offering long-term leases to fire survivors.
This is wild to me.
I would have hoped that number was higher, but it's pretty low. Not many of these short-term rental owners have been willing to house fire survivors, even with some of the super high rates that FEMA's offering.
So last time you were on here, we talked about some of these rates. So what are, for instance, do you know what a 2-bedroom short-term rental would be making per month on a FEMA lease or a CNHA lease?
Yeah, so there's a couple of pieces to the answer to that question. In terms of who has the most money to house fire survivors, it's like FEMA has way more money than anyone else.
Yeah.
Then the state has the next largest amount of money, and then CNHA operates with a much smaller budget than either of those two. So in terms of CNHA's housing program, we have been largely getting the cheapest leases we can find, so we can stretch our philanthropic dollars farther to house more people. The governor back in December talked about offering $5,000 for a 1-bedroom, $7,000 for a 2-bedroom, $9,000 for a 3-bedroom, and $11,000 for a 4-bedroom. My understanding is that they are offering those rates to short-term rentals in West Maui, and they're negotiating lower rates outside of West Maui, which is correct. Before the fire, West Maui short-term rentals were the most expensive short-term rentals on the island, right?
Yeah.
More expensive than South Maui. So it is, economically, it makes more sense that you should be paying more for these short-term rental conversions in West Maui than South Maui. And I think that my understanding is that the state program is, in fact, paying more to the West Maui short-term rental owners than the South Maui short-term rental owners. And then FEMA, they've been a little cagey about how much they're actually paying because they want to keep negotiating power, I assume. But, I believe they're pretty close to those governor's rates, 5,000, 7,000, 9,000.
Yeah, I think the fear on FEMA's part, too, is they don't want to trigger more inflation in the housing market. But even still, that 10% number is a bit shocking to me because you would think occupancy rates overall in West Maui would be way down in the wake of the fire than where they had been. And with that tax incentive and premium rental rates, it's just it's really astounding to me because you have regular landlords throughout Maui who are clamoring to sign up for these FEMA deals, so much so that the governor had to make a list with the Attorney General's office where people can report their landlord if they try and evict them in order to make a deal with FEMA and get this higher rate. Yet the short-term rental owners are just opting to have the low occupancy and get who they can.
Yeah, and in fact, the state DBEDT, the Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism, they publish occupancy rates every month, I think. And they do show that occupancy rates for short-term rentals are significantly lower than they were pre-fire.
Wild. Well, then you get into the tax implications. Let's walk through that.
Yeah, so like there's definitely an economic impact, right, to removing some of our short-term vacation rental supply. The easiest tax impact to measure is the impact on property taxes because it's short-term rentals that pay the highest property tax rates. And basically, if you look at the proposed 2025, fiscal year 2025 tax rates from the county, these Minatoya short-term rentals would bring in about $80 million as short-term rentals in property taxes. If they're no longer allowed to operate as short-term rentals, they're going to move into a different tax class. They're going to either, some number of them are going to become non-owner occupied, some number are going to become owner occupied, some will become long-term rentals, etc. And those all pay different tax rates. So we don't know exactly how much tax revenue we'll get post-ban if it happens. But, we can look at these different scenarios and basically if they all become non-owner occupied properties, the difference in tax revenue is going to be about $50 million. We're going to lose $50 million in tax revenue. If they all become owner-occupied units, which they won't, but if they were to all become owner-occupied units, then the differential is closer to $15 million in tax revenue. So the number varies. I think it's pretty safe to say that we're going to lose between $30 and $50 million in tax revenue if these Minatoya short-term rentals are phased out. And just to put that into context, right, the 2025 proposed revenue for the county is $1.25 billion, of which about $570 million comes from property taxes. So if we're losing between $30 and $50 million in property tax, that's hitting the budget, that's reducing the budget by 2.5 to 4% per year.
And I think that's a pretty conservative estimate because also part of the impact is going to be in the surcharge on the transient accommodation tax and the surcharge on the GET. If anybody has been to South Maui or lives in South Maui, if you're talking about removing 2,500 short-term rentals there's a lot of businesses that cater to those short-term rentals. So that's going to factor into the economic impact as well, just to be like completely honest with the data.
Yeah. So just to restate what you said, property taxes are just the easiest dollar figure to get, but there's also the transient accommodation tax, of which Maui County gets a portion. The state gets most of it, but Maui County gets a portion. And then the general excise tax. Yeah. And then moving on beyond the tax impact, I think it's important to understand more about who owns these properties, because there have been local owners who've spoken up and say, hey, I'm a local Maui County resident and I depend on these for my income. So if you look at the data, there's about 12.5% of these owners have Maui County mailing addresses. About a little bit less than 15% of the owners have Hawaii state addresses. So over 85% of these owners are out-of-state residents. Yeah, I think that just helps to address this issue, right? How much is it actually going to impact the revenue of the owners, at least, who live on Maui?
Yeah, this number, you have the actual just number of those units, and 2,230 of them have California addresses. And
that's right.
Yeah, and 489 have Canada addresses, and then it's kind of sprinkled there throughout. But only 893 have Hawaii addresses, and that includes Maui County and the rest of Hawaii as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow. So this is important from my perspective, because I tend to think in the political math. When this is going to come in front of the Maui County Council and the Maui Planning Commission, there's going to be a lot of folks testifying about this. A lot of them are going to be out of state. And it's important to note this is an election year, and phasing out these transient vacation rentals is incredibly popular among Maui residents. So if it's primarily going to impact non-Maui residents who don't vote here, I think the political implications of that are important to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of opponents of banning the short-term rentals have correctly pointed out that these units are not the panacea for housing people because of their size and their age. So I actually broke that down from looking at property tax records. 90% of these units are 1 or 2 bedroom units. So they're not huge units. 87% of these units were built in 1985 or before. So that's like almost 40 years ago. So these units are old and they're small. And finally, if you look at their assessed values, the median assessed values are like around $950,000, which is pretty expensive and out of the reach of a lot of residents. So we need to go into this knowing what we're getting, right? These are older units. They're not huge. They're assessed at higher values, although that assessment will change, right? As the ways you can use the units change as well.
Yeah. But that assessment isn't very far off from where the median condo price on Maui is right now. Like it's not outrageous to assume that a lot of the prices, if these do hit the open market, are going to be between $800,000 and $1 million.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If we have a 7% interest rate on mortgages and folks are trying to buy an $800,000 property, that's a big payment. And then there are the special assessments on top of that or maintenance fees, I guess. What were you going to say, Matt?
Yeah, I was going to say, so this kind of then starts veering into like the policy realm where it's not enough to just say, hey, we're going to ban these short-term rentals. You actually need a plan for how you're going to convert a significant or like a meaningful portion of these rentals into housing for our residents, right? Because if there is no policy plan, then they're just all going to become second homes for out-of-state residents, and we haven't helped the situation at all. I don't know what the answer is there, but it's important that this conversation be happening at the same time, right? That there's a policy plan at the same time. What sort of policies are we going to put in place? What sort of property tax incentives or disincentives are we going to put in place to kind of help to nudge these units into becoming long-term rentals or owner-occupied units, especially in the context of the prices that they're currently assessed at.
And honestly, it's almost a scarier prospect that you eliminate the short-term rental use and then they just become vacant second homes for the most part.
Yeah.
Because there's infrastructure that was developed to serve the public that isn't serving anybody. It's just sitting there. And then you lose all of that additional tax revenue from the people that are here going to restaurants, paying for tours and other activities. And so you're absolutely right. That policy piece of how do you incentivize the transfer to having these used as long term really needs to be in place before we really pull the trigger on eliminating the short term rental use. Have you guys talked about that at all? Has anybody got any good ideas over at CNHA?
Not really. I think that no one has really tackled the policy piece yet. And I guess the part I'm trying to play is just putting all the relevant data in front of the people who are empowered to make those decisions so that they can make good policy decisions. But I haven't seen anyone take up that policy mantle yet.
I think I've got some ideas, and I'll share those ideas separately. But one of the things that came up in the governor's State of the State address, I think, was he had an idea to waive conveyance tax and other taxes on the sale of properties to Hawaii residents or Maui residents specifically. And I think that's a really, really smart idea if you were doing it in conjunction with something like a phase out. Mm-hmm. That would make a lot of sense. Now, you are an incredibly humble guy, but you're also an incredibly smart guy. So I'm going to put you on the spot and I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. And the first question I have is, what would you say to the folks who bang that drum about tax revenue, how this will be devastating when it comes to property tax revenue and devastating when it comes to the transient accommodations tax and the GET tax?
Yeah, I would say that the number one priority is to house our people. And this was already an issue before the fire. It's just like so much worse now. So I think you have to house your people first before you worry about other things, right? Yeah, there's going to be an economic impact. There's going to be an impact on tax revenues, but there's already an impact on people leaving the island because they can't live here, and that's having an economic impact that's hard to measure. That's having an impact on tax revenues that's hard to measure. I would I think about solving problems as an engineer. You solve like the critical in your face problems first. And right now, the in your face problem we have is that there's not enough housing. So we need to tackle that. We were talking about Kihei, for example, but this also applies to other areas like Kahana. They weren't always so full of short-term rentals. Like if you go back 40, 50 years, there was a lot of residential housing there. And just because this is the way we've done things for the past few decades doesn't mean that that's the way it needs to be forever. I think that if there's ever a time to make a big decision and prioritize our residents and their ability to live here and their quality of life, that's maybe one of the silver linings of the fire, right? That we'll actually see some political will and some public will to make some hard decisions. I don't think it is, a slam dunk to phase out the short-term rentals because of the economic impacts. But I think that when I weigh the positives and the negatives, fully aware that there are many unknowns, right? It's unknown if we're going to be able to convert all of them into long-term housing. It's unknown whether we're still going to see good enough tourism numbers with people going to hotels and to short-term rentals in areas where they're allowed. There's lots of unknowns. But when I weigh the pros and cons that I can see from the data, I think for me, certainly as a resident, as someone who is raised here, who lives here, and this is my home and it's going to be my home, I would prioritize housing for residents above, having this glut of short-term rentals.
Yeah. I think you bring up so many good points. One of the huge points, and this was brought up by Carl Bonham over at UHERO pretty early on after the fires. When he provided an early economic assessment, he pointed out that the thing he's really terrified about is outmigration, because we've got just economic refugees fleeing Maui County now because housing is absurdly expensive. I saw one number quoted that the current price of a one-bedroom apartment compared to the price being paid by the fire victims before the fire occurred, the current price is about 75% of what their average income was. So how could somebody who was staying in a one-bedroom apartment, oftentimes with multiple adults in that same one-bedroom apartment, how could they maintain living here and working in the industries that they were working in, which were primarily tourism-related industries, food and bev, entertainment, stuff like that, hotel staff? And if those folks are forced to leave and flee to just find someplace where they can afford to live, all of the service that they provided, everything goes down. It gets eliminated. The quality of a trip to Maui goes down. You're staying in a hotel. The prices of coming to Maui go up. It has a real impact when you just allow people to leave because it's just impossible for them to live here. So I think that's getting ignored with a lot of this discussion about, the tax revenue. And I think what a lot of folks don't understand is that these extra 7,000 apartment zoned transient vacation rentals, they don't exist on the other islands. The other islands
that's right.
still have tourism as their main economic generator. They just don't have the same high number of transient accommodations in condominiums. So it's a bit dishonest to think that we're going to completely kill our economic driver if we get rid of these specific properties. Even as you pointed out, it's 4% of the property tax revenue.
4% of the county revenue.
Yeah, the county property tax. Or is it revenue overall or just the property tax revenue?
It's overall. Property tax makes up about half of the overall revenue, and it's about 4% of the overall revenue.
Excellent. Thank you for clarifying that. Even still, that 4%, we have the lowest property tax rates, I think, in the country as far as owner-occupied. So there's some room that can be made up in other tax classifications.
Yeah. And, honestly, if we're going to make up room in the other tax classifications, I would look at the massive number of non-owner occupied units we have on the island, right? Many of these units are second homes. I think if someone can afford to have a second home, they can afford to pay higher tax rates on that second home.
And
I would raise tax rates there before raising it on owner occupied.
I agree.
Units.
Yeah, because we have the owner occupied. A lot of those owners have owned it for a long time, and the increase in their property values is well beyond their control. So yeah, it can be oppressive, the property tax rates for the owner occupied if they go too high. The non-owner occupied also, just from a policy perspective, if you're going to buy up property here with how much it costs to build infrastructure, that infrastructure was meant to serve residents. And you're taking it offline when you just have a property that you keep vacant so you can come and visit whenever you want. As I said earlier, I think that's almost a worse impact on our economy than having tourists. Even if you have the worst behaved tourists, at least they're putting something in. I think the non-owner occupied vacant, just so I can use it a couple of times a year properties are more extractive and detrimental to us as a whole.
And you know what? You just made me think of something else, which is that if we don't convert some of these short-term rentals into housing for residents, the only option besides having people leave is to build more units for them, and largely that means bringing in new infrastructure and doing all this stuff. And none of that's going to happen very fast. Well, let's flip it around. If we're really worried about the economic impact of removing all these short-term rentals, fine. Build more short-term rentals or build more hotels or whatever. But let's take the housing we have now to solve the critical problem we have now, which is that no one can find housing. And then, let the economy take a hit for a few years and then build whatever needs to be built to support the economy. I think if we have to think of one class of people who needs to bear more of the brunt of this disaster, it's definitely not the displaced families. The displaced families have borne enough of the brunt of this disaster. Let's make it a little more inconvenient for people to travel cheaply to Maui for a little bit of time, right? For a couple years while we recover from this, just so we can house people. I'm okay making that trade-off. And hey, if it was a bad trade-off and it was bad to remove all these short-term rentals, then fine, go put in the extra infrastructure and build the extra units that we need to house those visitors again. But I'm willing to, personally, I think it's fine to forego that for a couple years and prioritize housing our residents.
I'm inclined to agree with you. I am. That's going to surprise some folks because in my past life, I had advocated against phasing out these short-term rentals. And I don't feel too bad about that advocacy when that occurred. But since then, and especially in the wake of the fires, I just can't see another solution, especially with what you pointed out, which is, okay, if we're not going to use these properties and we don't have any other properties, what are our options? The governor is trying really hard with these kauhales, which I fully support. I think the kauhale program is great, but that's not ideal housing either. We're talking about even smaller one-bedroom units that you're going to try and put people in, or 1 or 2 bedroom units. But those are incredibly small as well. And those are going to take a lot of money to develop and time to develop as well. So we don't put them in Kauhale. Where do we put them? We got to build more. And we can't build in West Maui anymore because limited water resources, no water upcountry to build. You can't build out in East Maui because, it's out of the way. It's difficult. And Central Maui, you need a wastewater treatment system that's not going to be in line until 2029. So the only real option that exists is to leverage whatever infrastructure we currently have that's existing, and that just happens to be these apartment zone condominium.
Yeah, and you have to make that choice. Is it more important to house the visitors or is it more important to house the residents for the next few years until we can build more?
Yeah, and the real key, I think the devil's going to be in the details. And when it comes to housing the residents effectively, it's going to be that policy piece that you pointed out, which is how do you create that pathway for these to go from short-term to long-term residential instead of just second owner or second homes. So I know right. You have to get going for another meeting, but thank you so much. Is there any last thing that you want to share? Any plug for something you're working on or links for people to visit?
Check out the Data Hub at app.helpingmaui.org/data/public. I'll keep updating that as I get information I'm allowed to share publicly. I'm basically trying to be a voice for making better decisions based on data. So I guess if anyone has any leads on important data that's in the public sector, that's publicly available, I would really love to know about it.
I love that. A voice for making better decisions based on data. That should be on your LinkedIn profile and your business card and everything else. That perfectly describes what you do. So thank you so much, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Jason.